started with everything. Welcome everybody to our conversation this evening. I'm going to, as I typically do, hit mute all. Just want to make sure that everybody is, that we don't have overlapping background noise, anything like that. Welcome everybody to our conversation this evening with Eric Rogers from the Frank Lloyd Wright Conservancy, one of the most prodigious and talented photographers of Chicago's architecture in the city, if I say so myself. Oh, I had a little wanted to put together. I had a slide to kind of welcome him and start everything off here. Let me open that up here. This is one of Eric's photos that he was kind enough to share with us. Wanted to give that quick image to you on screen just so you can see the kind of talent that we're talking about here. And we love having people who interpret Chicago, help us understand and appreciate the beautiful city. We're very happy to have Eric with us this Monday evening, and happy to have so many people with us as well joining in on our conversation. Chicago Detour is happy to keep on bringing events like this, these free virtual tours and talks to you, as we have been since the springtime. So with all of that being said, this is really Eric's show, and I'm just here to moderate, ask the questions, that sort of thing. So let me turn it over to him at this point. Eric, go ahead, introduce yourself to everybody.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, and thanks everyone for joining us here on Monday evening for what is hopefully a pleasant distraction. I know we all need that right now.
Yeah.
But for those who don't know me, I am the manager of events and communications at the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy, where I've been on staff actually only since February. So I basically had a month in the office before everything went sideways in this new role. But the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy is one of a number of sort of organizations in the community of Frank Lloyd Wright organizations. And what we do is facilitate the preservation and stewardship of all of the remaining built works of Frank Lloyd Wright. So we sort of serve as a convener and a supporter of all of his works, rather than owning and operating any of them or anything like that. So you probably haven't taken a tour with us or anything, but we're the ones who respond and try to keep any of the 400 buildings standing when there's a threat to one of them. And actually, if you're following local architecture news in the Chicago area, you may be aware that we're heavily involved in the move of a very small Frank Lloyd Wright building, Booth Cottage, up in Glencoe, that is actually going to be rolled down the street tomorrow at about 8 o'clock in the morning to a new location, because it had been purchased by developers who want to put up a McMansion. And you know, we were able, working with Landmarks Illinois and the Glencoe Historical Society, to broker a relocation that saved the building. So please don't try to visit. I'm obligated to say we don't want to create unsafe crowding up in Glencoe tomorrow, but at the end of the presentation, we'll share social media coordinates for the Conservancy, and you'll definitely want to check in. We'll have some great video and photos of that going up tomorrow and in the days after. The other things that I do as manager of events and communications at the Conservancy, obviously we are not having any in-person events in 2020. That ship sailed several months ago. So one thing that we've done that's been a lot of fun is there are roughly 70 public Frank Lloyd Wright sites around the country that you can visit, and almost all of them had to shut down. Some of them are starting to reopen now, but they all wanted to find a way to stay connected and you know, engage an audience even when people couldn't physically visit. And so a really fun project that we've done for the last few months, we've called Wright Virtual Visits. And it's been a weekly video swap where the stewards of different sites, like let's say the executive director of the Unity Temple Restoration Foundation, would record a little video addressed to the members and staff and supporters of Taliesin West out in Arizona. So that's been something I encourage you to check out on our website, which again, we'll have all those coordinates for you at the end. But we're going to be relaunching that in a fun new way on August 20th. And we'll actually be doing some live video facilitated by Zoom, just like everything these days, where we'll bring two sites together side by side to talk about some kind of common theme or design element or historical connection. Very brief. These are intended to be fun and light, but we just thought that would be an interesting way to experience some juxtapositions that you actually just can't do in real life if you go to one of these sites in person. So we're trying to make lemonade out of the lemons here and do something innovative. The other thing that I'm working on, and then I'll stop talking about the Conservancy, is we are planning a virtual conference instead of an in-person conference. We typically do an in-person gathering every fall, but that's been postponed. We were supposed to be in Buffalo, New York this year. But our virtual conference will take place November 11th through 14th. And we hope that a lot of people who wouldn't ordinarily come to an in-person conference will join us for all or part of it. We'll be announcing more details relatively soon. But again, we're trying to take advantage of the opportunity to bring experts together and showcase sites that we might never otherwise be able to take a whole conference group to in person. With that, I guess next question.
Sure. And actually, I did want to ask really quickly there. I know it was before your time since you just joined the Conservancy earlier this year, but was the organization involved last year when UNESCO created the Frank Lloyd Wright World Heritage Sites? Were they part of that process?
Thank you for making sure that I talk about the things that I really ought to talk about. Absolutely, that project was actually spearheaded over nearly 2 decades of work that it took to shepherd that UNESCO listing through. It was a really, really crazy process. Who knew when you sort of bring together architecture and historic preservation with international diplomacy, there are some insane stories. But yes, that's something that we really helped to spearhead and bring all the parties together and project manage. And actually the inscription happened just a little over a year ago.
Yeah.
I think about a week ago.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, the description there definitely does sound like a recipe for bureaucratic log jams. But yeah, that was just news that I thought was fantastic when it happened last year, and is one of those little tidbits I've been dropping into the tours ever since last summer, just because, hey, they're literally the only UNESCO World Heritage Sites in Chicago and in the surrounding region. So just figured I would ask, and happy to have landed on an answer there. So let me ask, and I did want to mention to all of our guests too, if you've got questions for Eric, comments or anything like that. I saw Lynn had commented that the Laurent House by Wright is open for visits by reservation out in Rockford. Feel free to share comments, or if you've got questions for Eric about his work, anything like that, you can put them into the group chat and I'll be moderating those to make sure that we try and get as many people's queries answered as we can in the half hour we have allotted here. So coming back to what I had prepared with you a little bit, Eric, what was your background? How did you get into the work you're doing with Frank Lloyd Wright Conservancy and with the other work you've done here in Chicago?
Yeah, so I have an academic background in cities, sort of urban sociology. That's the direction I drifted through college, and then through the master's that I did. And I know, Alex, you and I were in peer master's programs at the University of Chicago. So, but that's that's been my academic interest for a long time. I also have had a career of over a decade working in nonprofits in general, in a number of roles in fundraising and program management in particular. And so those are two of the main things that kind of led me to where I am now, working on public architecture programs, as I have for the last, at this point, almost 7 years. Most people, if you're local to Chicago, I'm sure you're familiar with Open House Chicago, the annual event put on by the Chicago Architecture Center. And I worked on that from 2014 through last year's event. So that That was really my baby, especially from 2017 to 2019. An absolutely amazing thing to get to work on, a really all-consuming project, as you might imagine, with something of that scale. So I have to confess, I am extremely glad that I am not responsible for trying to figure out how to pivot a 100,000 person event to virtual this year. I do understand they're working on it, and I think actually CAC is going to be announcing more about the format for this fall's event later this year. But really an amazing opportunity that I had to explore Chicago and then curate and highlight all kinds of cool, historic and quirky and interesting and important places all over the city, some of which I'll show you some photos of here in just a bit. And I'll say one more thing about Open House, and then, if there are any brief questions before we move on, which is Open House Chicago is part of a worldwide network of similar events. There are more than 50 other cities that do something similar. Most of them, if not all of them, are not doing it in person this year. Although in future years, as we think about traveling again, I highly recommend that you do some research and travel to some of these events. I've been lucky enough to experience them in a number of cities around the country and around the world. And it's great. But what's cool that's happening this year is a lot of them are doing it virtually, which means you can participate from right here in Chicago. So actually, I spent this past weekend as a virtual participant in Open House Buenos Aires in Argentina. And this coming weekend is Open House Melbourne, Australia. That's my weekend plan: camp out in front of the air conditioner and look at awesome architecture and listen and learn. So that's my plug for Open House. It's definitely something worth paying attention to.
Yeah. Open House is always one of those weekends, even though it was always crazy as a tour guide for another company, navigating all the crowds and stuff like that. I always loved when the sites would be announced, being able to look at all the places that I hadn't visited or seen, the incredible photography that you had created of some of those places that were part of Open House every October. So yeah, I'm sure they're working on how to transition that. I did have to mention, I was saying to some of the guests before you joined the chat, my in-laws are visiting. My mother-in-law has come out to Chicago multiple times to go to Open House Chicago from Cleveland every October, like specifically just that weekend for that one trip. And she keeps muttering for years now that Cleveland needs to do something like that, but I think her muttering hasn't made it happen yet. But we're putting that out there into the world for Pam Katona, just to satisfy her on some level. So we got a couple of questions there from our guests. I think I'll kind of circle back to those in a few minutes here. But why don't we, like I was saying, in my introduction there, you obviously work with architecture here in Chicago, but a lot of what I've seen of you over the past couple of years has been your photography, which I mentioned in conjunction with Open House, but I think it's also just a longtime passion of yours. So did you want to share any particular places or any particular work of yours in local architecture photography, just to share with us some of your favorites?
Yeah, well, so this, I'm going to tip my hand now as to why I didn't sign on until 2 minutes before, which is that, I didn't want to overthink it. I didn't want to predetermine what I was going to show, because I kind of wanted to react and be in the moment here. But I'm going to try to share my screen. Bear with me for just a moment.
Yeah, you should be able to.
And you should be seeing a picture of a beautiful church now, hopefully.
Yep, I can see it. If anyone else can't see it, let me know in the group chat, and we'll try and troubleshoot that for you. But yes, I can see your screen there, Eric.
Yeah. So, photography has been a passion of mine. It's something my parents bought me a camera for my 9th birthday. And then spent God knows how much on film before I finally went digital in 2003. Thank goodness. Oh, great. There's a lawn care crew across the street. A little late for that. Sorry. Hopefully that's not coming through too strong.
You're fine.
But what I decided I wanted to showcase here are some of my favorite places on the south side of Chicago specifically. So I've been a resident of the south side for like 16 of the 17 years I've lived in Chicago, very, very much by choice. I did a 1-year stint on the north side and moved the heck back. I think that there is so much to appreciate and celebrate on the south side. This photo is, it is a photo that I took of an open house site, and a number of these will be. This is the Second Presbyterian Church in the Prairie Avenue district. This is the furthest north photo that I'll share today. Just an absolutely amazing, sorry?
20th Street is as far north as you'll go?
Exactly. Well, I haven't been north of 39th Street since March 13th. Oh. So doing pretty good with my staying at home. But this is an amazing church. It's a National Historic Landmark, the only church with that designation here in Chicago. Worth a visit whenever they reopen. They offer tours. It's a stunning interior.
From what I understand, that's one of the rare examples of arts and crafts interior architecture here in Chicago too, yeah.
It is, yes. No, looks like I advanced. There was a devastating fire that wiped out the original interior. So Howard Van Doren Shaw did a new interior in the arts and crafts style, which is really unique and distinctive. And there aren't many church interiors in that style here, and very few of that level of quality. So I think, that's why I wanted to show this in particular. So let me see if I can actually, okay, there we go. Now I'm having an embarrassing moment where it's gonna take me a second to remind myself of which church this is. Oh yeah, St. Mary of Perpetual Help in Bridgeport. This is a church, a Catholic church that fairly recently restored these gold leaf domes in the last few years, and really one of the most lavish interiors for a church on the south side. As you'll see, there's a theme here, which is that I love photographing monumental interior spaces, which means a lot of churches. For something totally different, this is Augustana Lutheran Church in Hyde Park. And this is the late 1960s, kind of brutalist church by Edward Dart. It's all Chicago common brick and concrete. I feel like churches like this right now are probably underappreciated. They're going on 50 years old. A lot of people hate this style, and a lot of these buildings are going to get torn down, and I think it's a shame. So I've tried to highlight some buildings like this through open house and photography in general as well, because to me, there's such a unique experience when you go into this. It's very cave-like, and so it's quiet and meditative in a really different way.
Yeah, and like you were saying, that monumental feel to it definitely comes through.
This is St. Michael the Archangel Church. It's a Catholic church at 83rd Street and South Shore Drive. It's right on the doorstep of where the U.S. Steel South Works used to be, in the neighborhood called The Bush in South Chicago. It has the largest stained glass windows in the Archdiocese of Chicago. Wow. It's an amazing example of a Polish cathedral style Catholic church, because there was a large immigrant Polish population working in the mill there. And this is a building that, I'm really worried about the future for this building, because the economic and the population base in that neighborhood is just not there to support something like this. But a really stunning space.
Yeah, and I know Preservation Chicago, I think it was last year, they listed a bunch of the Catholic churches around the city as sites that were potentially in danger, just because the Archdiocese has been shuttering some of them, and yeah, that sort of thing, yeah.
Yeah, the Archdiocese is going through a process of merging and closing a lot of sites, a lot of their churches, unfortunately. Yeah. This is another one of my favorites. This is First Church of Deliverance at 43rd and Wabash in Bronzeville. This is really one of the two churches that, or one of the handful of churches that can claim to be kind of the cradle of gospel music. and they've actually had a radio broadcast of their services for many decades. It's also probably the only streamlined, modern style church that I know of anywhere, really. And it's got this amazing light-up cross on the ceiling over the center aisle. Just so much crazy detail there, and the nicest people to work with in Open House Chicago as well.
And yeah, this was one that I remember I'm not sure I'd ever seen before it became an open house site a couple of years ago, but the photographs by you and by Lee Bay, who works for the Sun-Times, who did the book about Southside architecture, Southern exposure. Hello to the cat there. Really, they've made this place, I think, a local landmark in a lot of ways. If you're just putting it on the map, or at least kind of broadening the audience a little bit for spectacular stuff like this that probably does get overlooked a little too frequently.
Yeah. This is another Catholic church. This is St. Benedict the African, which is in Englewood. And this building was actually built in the 1980s. It's the only Catholic parish that was designed from the ground up for an African-American parish. So it's not in this picture, but it actually has a 10,000 gallon full immersion baptismal font, which is not the normal equipment for a Catholic church. But, you know, I just love that it's going for cultural relevance. It's trying to speak to the people that it intends to serve. And I think there's something really powerful about that.
I love that roof. That is just incredible.
Yeah, the overall form was inspired by traditional African dwellings, which is why it's in the round. Yeah, it's really intimate and beautiful.
Yeah.
This is a chapel, I think you would call it that, at KAM Isaiah Israel, which is a synagogue famously across the street from the Obama's house in Kenwood. Their main sanctuary is a sort of Byzantine Gothic. It's an amazing space in its own right. But this is part of an addition that was done, I think, obviously in the 1960s. I'm fairly certain the architect was a fellow named Ron Dursmith, who is best known for being the sort of house architect for Hugh Hefner and Playboy. And, you know, you can tell he just had this really groovy style. Yeah, it's like the surface of the moon.
Yeah, I recognize that one right away. As my wife is commenting here, she used to work at KAM Isaiah Israel for a couple of years there. So I know both, the smaller space as well as the main sanctuary fairly well there. I was wondering if that one was going to pop up just because I know you had said you appreciated that mid-60s style of architecture that you were talking about there.
Of course, not all monumental spaces are churches, and this is one that I think is, you know, it needs everybody's thoughts and probably at some point everybody's help. This is the Avalon Regal Theater, which is at 79th and South Chicago Avenue and Stony Island, one of the busiest intersections on the south side. You've probably seen the minaret if you've driven by on the Chicago Skyway. But this is an atmospheric movie palace from 1926, super architecturally significant, actually in fairly good shape, because it had been restored in the 90s to some extent. But it's shuttered and, you know, has a really uncertain future right now. The owner is doing the best that he can, not necessarily getting the support he needs from the city, you know, and I contrast that with, you know, the city pulling out all the stops on the uptown, although even that right now, I think everybody's watching and waiting with some nerves about what's going to happen with that restoration.
Yeah, this is one, it always threw me for a loop the first couple of years that I saw it, just because it's not far from the headquarters of the Nation of Islam. And so for a couple of years, I was like, is there a relation? It took me a while to put together that it was an old movie palace. But yeah, famous, like you said, right by the Skyway. And really, God, I love those old movie palaces with that interior that feels like an old world setting. It's really spectacular stuff. Yeah, we wish all the best to the Avalon Theater.
It's supposed to be a Persian market. The architect was said to have been inspired by an incense burner. And some monumental spaces are industrial, and this is, particularly important at happy hour. This is actually inside the plant in back of the yards, which is a former meat packing facility, and it's now sort of an alternative food production space. And this specifically is the home of Weiner beer, my favorite, or one of my favorite Southside breweries. So just had to throw that in there. Exploring the city, of course, there are a lot of amazing exteriors too, and I want to pick up the pace. I'm sorry, can y'all hear me okay? It's definitely outside. Okay.
I can hear you fine, at least, yeah.
Great. So this is the Rosenwald Courts Apartments up in Bronzeville. This is a beautiful apartment complex that was developed as affordable housing in this amazing streamlined style. Came very close to being torn down. It was vacant for well over a decade and falling apart, but it's been fully restored as affordable housing thanks to a really big team effort and just a beautiful place on the south side. I couldn't get through this whole presentation without an actual picture of a Frank Lloyd Wright's house. So here's one that I biked by not too long ago, the Heller House, which is up in Hyde Park. It's actually for sale right now if anybody's in the market, but a really beautiful this is 1896. So you can really see the influence of Louis Sullivan in this because this is very, very early in Wright's career as an independent architect. A lot of my photography on the South Side has an advocacy bent to it, and that's one of the things that really motivates me to get out and explore and document. This is the current appearance of the Washington Park National Bank building, which is at the intersection of 63rd Street and Cottage Grove in Woodlawn. This building is one of the only historic buildings left along 63rd Street, and it's made it this far. Unfortunately, the Cook County Land Bank, which owns it, has selected a redevelopment proposal that involves demolishing it now, which is just beyond infuriating. So I'm very sad that I agreed to let them use this image for free when they did a charrette, because they chose the option I didn't want them to choose.
Yeah.
Just capturing the everyday fabric of the city, I think, is really important. Obviously this was a really dramatic sunset a summer or two ago. But I think a lot of people wouldn't know that there is a space that looks like this in Chicago, unless you're familiar with the neighborhood I live in, which is South Shore. This is actually 71st Street, our major east-west commercial corridor, and the Metro Electric runs at grade right down the middle of the street, making this really unusual and I think really charming and interesting.
I want to say that might be the only at-grade commuter train in the city, if I'm recalling correctly.
Within the city limits, well, this is too nerdy of a conversation to go into, probably. Yeah. It's definitely the only median-running commuter rail anywhere in the city.
Always important to add those qualifiers that make a statement correct, right?
Yeah. And then, just kind of capturing our amazing environment and cityscape is, it's never dull. This is the view from Rainbow Beach, which is down. You can access it from 79th Street, at kind of the south end of South Shore Drive. But absolutely amazing. The beach is half a mile long. There's actually a prairie preserve there that's got native prickly pear cacti growing in it, and just this amazing uninterrupted skyline view.
Yeah.
Just to my north is Jackson Park. You might recognize this as a view from the Osaka Garden, which is on Wooded Isle, just south of the Museum of Science and Industry, which you see there. This is a photo that you've probably seen a lot of times if you've followed any of the debate about the construction of the Obama Presidential Center in Jackson Park, which is going to be really, really disruptive to this part of the park, unfortunately, really kind of loom over a lot of this beautiful landscape. seems like it's going to go forward as planned at this point, but you know, a lot of neighbors have raised a lot of concerns, and it's been very frustrating to see the city and the Obamas kind of steamroll those, especially to do that to a lot of activists that gave him his political start. I think has been kind of demoralizing. And linked to that project is the supposed Tiger Woods golf course, which proposes to merge the Jackson Park and South Shore Cultural Center golf courses, which are currently adjacent to each other but separate. And somehow it's going to merge an 18-hole course and a 9-hole course into one 18-hole course that needs even more space than it currently takes up. And they want to obliterate really what I think is one of the most beautiful places in the entire city, which is the South Shore Nature Sanctuary. This is the view from the South Shore Nature Sanctuary, which is just by the beach at the South Shore Cultural Center. Currently still officially closed for some inexplicable reason, even though we can go to bars, we can't go to nature centers, at least until the end of this week, and then we can't go to bars. But this is what the Nature Sanctuary path looks like, a beautiful natural respite in the city. It's got 4 different habitats: dune, prairie, wetland, and forest in a pretty small footprint. And it's a spectacular space that has spectacular views, which is why they want to put a hole of golf there, which I think is contemptible, frankly. And I will chain myself to something if it comes to that. So, like I said, I have some opinions, and I use my photography as a way to rally support for those opinions. But, you know, exploring the city is something that I recommend everybody do, no matter where you are. Get out. If you're able to get your hands on a bicycle, and I know that they're basically sold out everywhere right now, but that's the main way that I've done my exploration of the city over many years now. This is one of my other favorite places. This is the 95th Street Bridge over the Calumet River, with Calumet Fisheries just out of frame to the right. Yep. Get some smoked fish, and then just taking this amazing view. So yeah, that's basically it. Happy to take some questions. I'll leave this up. These are kind of the coordinates where you can find and follow the Frank Lloyd Wright Building Conservancy, as well as my social media. If you want just the pretty pictures, follow me on Instagram. If you want the pretty pictures and the politics, follow me on Twitter.
Where I think you and I have retweeted each other about both of those things over the past couple of months here. Well, thank you for sharing all of that with us, Eric. We did have a couple of questions that I'm sure we can swing to really quickly. I know when we were talking about the Second Presbyterian Church by Prairie Avenue, Pat had asked what makes it arts and crafts. I can answer that one really quickly. Arts and crafts was a particular architectural movement at the close of the 19th century that tried to, I'm going to mangle my definition now that I've launched into it. It essentially tried to simplify the architectural styles that had been getting kind of over the top in the Victorian age, and tried to rely on more traditional sort of handcrafted, hence arts and crafts, materials and designs. It was actually a pretty big influence on, or at least contemporaneous with Frank Lloyd Wright's Prairie School. So that was something that was more common in Britain, but you do find some examples in the US, and the Second Presbyterian Church is a nice example of it there. Trenton had asked about the World Heritage Site, and that's another one I can tackle kind of quickly. UNESCO listed several of Frank Lloyd Wright's most famous American works of architecture as a new World Heritage Site last summer, and locally, the places that were included are the Roby House in Hyde Park, and then the Frank Lloyd Wright Home and Studio and Unity Temple in Oak Park. And it also included, I believe, Taliesin West, and Falling Water, where I think the other sites on the UNESCO World Heritage Site.
So there are 8 sites. Locally, the Home and Studio ended up not making the list.
Oh, and really?
Again, this gets into the weird institutional politics and the layers of review and the very strange criteria for World Heritage designation. But yeah, there are 8 sites that all together are inscribed as one single site across multiple locations, which again is sort of a confusing artifact of the way the World Heritage list works.
Yeah, people are correcting me in the comments, and I love that. I thought the home and studio was included, but not the Guggenheim, and of course I got that
The way
backwards.
around, yeah.
Yeah, but that's a pretty big deal, obviously, getting something listed in the UNESCO World Heritage List. Taking a look at some of the other questions we'd gotten, Trenton had also asked about those Frank Lloyd Wright Conservancy visits. Are any of the previous ones still available? Are there recordings or anything like that?
Yeah, they're actually all recorded, although it took us about a month into the project to realize that we should compile them all in one place. But if you go to our website, savewright.org/Wright virtual visits, or you can just find it from the front page, you'll actually see they're collected by week in the post that you'll find there. So you can go through, and they're just a bunch of videos embedded that you can play one at a time. And they range. I mean, it's been such a charming project because some of them are just like a 60-second silent sort of pan through some really beautiful space. And then others, there was one site that did a 15-minute full top to bottom tour. So you sort of get a whole range of different experiences, and a lot of the unique personality of both the sites and the people that, work at them and support them comes through in those videos.
Yeah. And similarly, somebody around I think it was Trenton as well, asking about those visits. I remember he had asked, and I remember something about this earlier. Taliesin West, there was talk of it shuttering or something like that earlier this year. Do you recall anything about that, Eric?
So probably what Trenton is thinking of is what has been known as the School of Architecture at Taliesin, which is the successor to the apprentice program that Frank Lloyd Wright established, which he had apprentices that were part of the program that split their time along with him between Taliesin up in Wisconsin in the summer, and then Taliesin West in Scottsdale, Arizona in the winter. There's a lot of really complicated institutional stuff that happened, and a lot of it actually went down like the week I started. But essentially, there's been a split between the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation, which owns and operates Taliesin West, owns but does not operate Taliesin, and the school, which they're separating, and the school is actually moving to Arcosanti, which is a different, very remarkable architectural space in Arizona. And it remains to be seen exactly what will happen, but I know, the school is going to try to continue providing the kind of unique experience that it has provided, even though it won't be at Taliesin and Taliesin West anymore. And I know that the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation will be working to add educational programming and offerings to sort of fill the void that the school leaves as it departs.
Yeah. And even just hearing that explanation, it's becoming more clear why creating the UNESCO site took nearly 2 decades. We had a couple of other things, but I do want to respect everybody's time, make sure that we're not eating up your entire evening. I know we had Lynn suggesting when we were looking at the Avalon Theater, visiting the Coronado Theater out in Rockford, which is another one of those grand old movie palaces. Thank you for that suggestion there. Joan had also mentioned the Roby House is open for tours once again, which is nice to hear. It's actually, I think the last time I went inside the Roby House is when I was a student at U Chicago, so I'm probably due for a visit down there.
It's had a full restoration since then.
Yeah. Which makes it even more worth visiting. I think one last quick question for Eric. Joan asked, do you know what, if anything, is going on at the Shoals Baking Company building?
So, I mean, I can't speak to right at the present moment. I can tell you what is intended, which is that it's being converted to a data center, which is actually a pretty great use for such a sort of heavy concrete and masonry building. It's located right near the Dan Ryan, which actually puts it very close to major fiber optic trunk lines that run around the southern end of Lake Michigan and then up to downtown. So that's the plan. I know work has been done. I don't know, as of the start of the pandemic, what the status of it is, unfortunately.
But that's at
Sorry.
least the story. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, turning it into a data center is actually probably pretty good news.
I can tell you that the owner is somebody who has been very patient with this project and is committed to a good outcome for it, and he's somebody that I respect a lot. So I'm optimistic that it'll get done, even if it doesn't happen on the time frame that anyone's hoping for.
All right. Well, that is great to hear. Thank you again, Eric, for joining us this evening. Thank you, everybody, for being with us. We ran long here, but it was an interesting conversation. I was happy to let us run long a couple of minutes here. Did want to mention really quickly, plugging Chicago Detours ever so briefly. We'll be back here. Of course, more virtual tours. Amanda's going to be on here tomorrow night doing one of our virtual vacations. We're going to Eastern Sicily tomorrow evening. And I believe Amanda is also on deck for Thursday. Our next installment of the Architecture Crash Course is going to be looking at Mies van der Rohe and the mid-century modernist style that redefined architecture in Chicago. So you can join her in the next couple of days. I'm going to put the link into the group chat really quickly. If you ever want to reach out to us to book a private experience like this, we've been landing more private virtual tours over the past month or so here. We wanted to make sure people knew we were available to do that. You can charter us if you want to think of it that way. And beyond that, thank you everybody for your time. Thank you, Eric, especially for being kind enough to join us this evening. I hope everybody enjoyed themselves. I certainly always love getting a chance to see Eric's photos and hear his thoughts about that. Looks like Stephen in the comments was doing the same, saying Eric should be the play-by-play with me as the color commentator on Chicago architecture.
Somebody else has to be the timekeeper. I always run long.
We'll have to find a producer somewhere on Twitter. But thank you everybody for tuning in this evening. I hope you saw and heard some fascinating stuff. I know I did. So thank you again. Thank you, Eric, and to all of you, and cheers to everybody. My glass is empty, but I'll say cheers anyway for being with us this Monday evening. Night, everyone.
All right.